Here's something that unsettles people the first time they really understand it. A narcissist's next move, whatever situation they're currently in with you, was very likely already determined before this specific relationship even began. Not because they sat down and strategized against you specifically, but because the pattern itself, refined across every previous relationship, every previous conflict, every previous moment where control started slipping, runs largely on autopilot at this point. Which means, in a strange and genuinely useful way, you can often predict what's coming next, not through intuition, but through pattern recognition. Today, we're going to break down exactly how this works, why a narcissist's next move so often feels inevitable in hindsight, what's actually driving that predictability, and how understanding this pattern gives you something genuinely valuable, not control over what they do, but the ability to stop being caught off guard by it. Let's start with the foundational principle, because it explains why this predictability exists at all. A narcissistic psychological structure, as we've discussed throughout this entire series, doesn't operate primarily through conscious, deliberate strategy the way a mustache-twirling villain might. It operates through a limited, well-worn set of responses, developed and reinforced over years across many different relationships, each one teaching the same lesson. These particular moves work reliably on most people most of the time. This means the plan isn't really a plan in the deliberate sense. It's closer to a groove worn so deep through repetition that the person runs through it almost automatically, the moment a familiar trigger, loss of control, perceived rejection, threat to their self-image, appears. This is exactly why so many people who've been through a relationship with a narcissist describe an eerie sense of déjà vu when they finally compare notes with that person's previous partners, previous friends, previous colleagues, the same phrases, the same sequence of events. Sometimes, almost word for word, the same apology, the same accusation, the same charm offensive, deployed in a completely different relationship, years apart, as though pulled from an identical script. This isn't coincidence. It's exactly what you'd expect from a pattern that isn't actually being custom built for each new person, but simply being reapplied, because it's the only real toolkit available. Here's what this means practically for predicting what happens next in your own specific situation. The most reliable way to know what a narcissist is likely to do isn't to try to get inside their head in this particular moment. It's to look at the actual documented pattern their behavior has already revealed, both with you and, if you have access to it, with the people who came before you. Patterns repeat because the underlying psychological structure producing them hasn't changed. This is genuinely one of the most useful, practical tools available to you because it replaces anxious, uncertain guessing with something closer to informed anticipation. Let's walk through what this predictability actually looks like at each stage of a relationship, because the next move is different depending on where you currently are. If you're still early in recognizing the pattern, mid-relationship, the next move, if you've recently started setting boundaries or noticed inconsistency, is very likely to be some version of intensification, either escalated charm to pull you back into compliance or escalated conflict designed to make you doubt whether the boundary was reasonable in the first place. This isn't random. It's the direct, predictable result of a control-dependent psychological structure encountering resistance for the first time in a while. If you've already begun pulling away, building distance and boundaries, the next move is very likely to follow the sequence we discussed in an earlier conversation about the 5 reactions to being seen as no longer controllable. Old tactics repeated with more intensity, confusion disguised as concern, sudden charm, attempts to recruit outside opinion, and eventually, devaluation. Which specific reaction comes first often depends on which one has historically worked fastest for them, which means paying attention to their pattern with you specifically, not just the general sequence, gives you an even more accurate prediction. If you've already left and stayed gone, the next move is very likely one of two things. both of which we've discussed in previous conversations. Either narrative reconstruction, where the relationship gets rewritten to protect their self-image, or a fairly rapid search for replacement supply, redirecting the same pattern towards someone new rather than genuinely reflecting on what happened with you. Now here's where this becomes genuinely useful rather than just an interesting theoretical framework, because understanding that the next move is largely predetermined by pattern rather than by anything you specifically do changes something important about how you experience it when it actually arrives. We need to answer the deeper question: why doesn't the script ever change? Why would someone keep using the exact same phrases, the exact same accusations, the exact same cycle of idealization and devaluation with person after person, year after year, even when it clearly destroys relationships? To understand this, you have to stop thinking about their behavior as a choice and start thinking about it as architecture. A psychologically flexible person has dozens of ways to respond to feeling hurt, rejected, or out of control. They can self-reflect. They can apologize genuinely. They can sit with discomfort. They can have an uncomfortable but honest conversation. They can regulate their emotions internally. A narcissistic structure does not have access to that range. This is not an insult, it's a structural reality. When the entire psychological system is built around one non-negotiable job, protecting a fragile, inflated self-image at all costs, there are only a very limited number of moves that actually accomplish that job. Think of it like this: if your only tool is a hammer, every problem will look like a nail. If your only psychological tools are deflection, projection, charm, rage, and playing the victim, then every interpersonal problem will be met with one of those tools. Nothing else exists in the toolbox. That is why the pattern is so predictable. It is not that they have 100 strategies and they choose the most manipulative one. It is that they have only a handful of strategies total, period. And they have been forced to become exceptionally good at those few strategies because they have nothing else to rely on. Over decades, those limited moves get refined to a terrifying level of efficiency. The love bombing becomes smoother. The gaslighting becomes more subtle. The devaluation becomes more precisely targeted at your specific insecurities. Not because they are studying you like a genius strategist, but because they have said the same line hundreds of times before, and they have learned, through pure trial and error, which version of it gets the most reaction. If you watch closely, you will notice the next move is never random. It is always activated by one of three specific psychological triggers. Learn these triggers, and you can predict the next move with almost unsettling accuracy. The first trigger is loss of control. This is the most common one. The moment you show independent thought, a boundary, a private opinion, a friendship they don't control, or a decision made without their approval, the system registers this as a threat. The predictable next move is a control restoration maneuver. This will show up either as intensified charm, sudden gifts, affection, nostalgia, a conversation about remember how good we are, or as intensified conflict, where a fight is picked out of nowhere and you are accused of being selfish, cold, or changing. Both have the same purpose: to pull you back into the groove where you are explaining yourself and they are in the position of judge. The second trigger is exposure. This is when they feel seen, not necessarily exposed to the world, but seen by you. You name the pattern. You calmly say, "This is what you always do when I say no." For most people, that would be a moment for reflection. For a narcissistic structure, being seen accurately is experienced as an existential attack. The predictable next move here is not accountability. It follows a very familiar sequence that we have discussed before. It starts with flat denial, "That never happened." Then comes reversal, "You are the one who does that to me." Then comes confusion disguised as concern, where they start questioning your memory or your mental health with a worried tone. After that comes recruiting third-party validators, where suddenly friends, family, or mutual contacts are hearing a very different story about you. And finally, it lands on punishment through devaluation, where you go from being amazing to being labeled as crazy, toxic, or abusive in their narrative because if you are defective, your accurate perception can be dismissed. The third trigger is abandonment, real or perceived. This is when you actually begin to leave, emotionally or physically. You become quieter. You stop arguing. You make plans that don't include them. This is the most dangerous trigger for their self-image because it proves they are not as central and indispensable as the internal story requires. The predictable next move here is a rapid oscillation between two extremes that look opposite but have the same root. One side is hoovering, pulling with extreme intensity, tears, promises, future faking so romantic it almost makes you forget everything. The other side is discarding, pushing with extreme cruelty, trying to be the one to end it first so they can say I left them. Often they will do both within hours of each other. This is not confusion on their part. It is a system frantically trying both control strategies at once to see which one sticks. If you know which of the three triggers you just activated, you already know which chapter of the script is about to be read. This is also why comparing notes feels like reading the same script. When you finally talk to the ex, the former best friend, the former business partner, you expect differences. You expect to hear, well, it was different with me, and instead you hear word for word repetition, the same pet name used in the love bombing phase, the same exact insult during devaluation, the same story about how all my exes are crazy. This happens because memory in this structure is not stored as what happened with Sarah or what happened with Ahmed. It is stored as what works when someone does this particular thing. The person is interchangeable. The trigger and the successful response are what gets remembered. This is why an apology from this structure never feels like it was truly about you, because it wasn't. It was the apology that worked 3 relationships ago to end a fight and restore control. It is being replayed, not felt. And this is the most freeing realization you can have. Nothing that is happening is as personal as it feels. The cruelty is not because you are uniquely unlovable. The charm is not because you are uniquely magical. Both are simply the current application of a very old, very impersonal pattern. Now we come to the part that actually matters. Because predictability is useless if it only makes you a more anxious fortune teller, constantly scanning the horizon for the next attack. The real value of knowing the next move is not that you can outmaneuver them. It is that you can finally stop playing. There is a fundamental shift that happens when you move from reaction to anticipation. And that shift changes everything. Most people, when they first learn about narcissistic patterns, make a very understandable mistake. They think if I can predict their next move, I can finally prepare the perfect response. I can say the one thing that will make them finally understand, finally take accountability, finally change. This is still playing by the old rules. It is still believing that if you just find the right words, you can control their next move. You cannot. And that is precisely the point. When you truly understand that the next move is predetermined by their internal structure, not by your performance, you stop asking, what should I say to make them act differently? And you start asking a much more powerful question. Given that I know what they are likely to do next, what do I want to do with my time, energy, and peace? The power was never in controlling them. The power is in becoming uncontrollable by the pattern. And anticipated manipulation loses most of its power. Think about it. Gaslighting only works if you are caught off guard and start genuinely questioning your reality. Love bombing only works if you believe this time the change is finally real. The smear campaign only works if you are frantically running around trying to defend your character to everyone. But when you have already predicted it, when you have quietly thought to yourself, I set a boundary yesterday, so today will likely be either an intense charm offensive or a sudden conflict about something unrelated. When it arrives, it doesn't feel like reality anymore. It feels like a script being performed on cue. and you cannot be as hurt by a performance you saw coming. This is what we mean by informed anticipation. You are no longer in the storm, being tossed by every wave. You are watching the weather report and deciding whether you even need to go outside. So, how do you practice this in real life starting today? Start by documenting the pattern, not the person. For the next week, stop journaling about what they meant or what they feel. Start journaling only observable facts. Create 3 simple columns in your mind or on paper. First column is the trigger. What happened right before the shift? Did you set a boundary, say no, have independent joy, or disengage? Second column is the move itself. What did they do? Word for word, action for action. Third column is the purpose. What did this move try to make you feel or do? Guilty, confused, responsible for their emotions? If you do this for even 7 days, you will have your own predictive manual. You will see that there are not 50 different problems. There are just a couple of triggers leading to a couple of moves on loop. Then, pre-decide your response when you are calm. The worst time to decide how to handle hoovering is when you are lonely late at night and you get the "I miss you so much" text. The worst time to decide how to handle a rage is when you are being yelled at. The trick is to pre-decide. Tell yourself in advance, when the charm comes after I set a boundary, I will not engage in a long conversation. I will acknowledge briefly and end the interaction. When the accusation comes that I am selfish, I will not defend my character for hours. I will say, I understand you see it that way, and disengage. You are writing your own script in advance, so you are not improvising inside their script. And finally, learn to let the prediction come true without intervention. This is the hardest and most healing part. When you predict they will try to recruit a mutual friend this week and then it happens, your instinct will be to rush and correct the story. Don't. Just watch. Say to yourself, there it is, exactly as predicted. This is the pattern confirming itself, not new information about me. Every time you let a predicted move happen without abandoning yourself to chase it, you teach your nervous system something profound. I can see this. I can feel the discomfort of it. And I can still remain anchored in my own reality. The pattern needs your participation to complete itself. Your non-reaction is not passive. It is the active breaking of a cycle that may have run for decades. I want to leave you with this, because this is where real peace begins. For a long time, you have likely believed that if you could just be clearer, kinder, more patient, more understanding, you could get to a different ending with this person. Understanding that their next move is already planned frees you from that exhausting job. It was never about you not being enough. It was about you encountering a closed loop, a groove so deep that no amount of your love, logic, or effort could fill it in. You cannot heal a pattern by participating more perfectly in it. You heal by stepping out of it. Their next move is already planned, but yours is not. Yours is still entirely yours to choose. And the moment you choose a move that is not about them, not a reaction to them, not designed to manage them, but simply about what is healthy and peaceful for you, the entire game ends. Not because they decided to stop, but because you did.